My name is Patricia and this story happened when I was 63 years old. My son invited his coworkers to dinner, and I spent 2 days cooking for people I had never met. I made a roast the way his father used to like it, and a pie from scratch, and I set the table with the good china I usually only bring out at Christmas. I cleaned every room in the house, even the ones no guest would ever see, because that is simply how I am, and because Daniel had asked me, in that particular tone he'd been using more and more since he made partner, to make sure everything looked presentable. I didn't mind. I told myself I didn't mind. He was my son, and it had been a long time since he'd asked me for anything at all, so I welcomed the chance to be useful to him, the way I had been useful to him his whole life. When the guests arrived, I was in the kitchen finishing the gravy, wearing an apron over one of my nicer dresses, and I came out to greet them the way I would greet anyone stepping into my home. Daniel was standing in the entryway with his colleagues, 4 or 5 of them, dressed the way people dress when they've never had to worry about the cost of dressing well, and his wife, Melissa, was beside him in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I smiled at all of them. I was reaching out my hand to the woman closest to me when Daniel spoke first. "Don't mind her," he said, with a little laugh, the kind of laugh people use when they want a comment to seem lighter than it is. "She's just the maid." I don't know exactly what I expected to feel in that moment, but it wasn't what I actually felt, which was a strange, sudden stillness, as if the room had gone quiet around me even though nobody had stopped talking. I looked at my son's face and saw that he wasn't joking. Not really, he'd said it easily, automatically, the way you'd explain away a stain on the carpet, and he had already turned back to his guests before he even finished the sentence. As if the matter were settled and there was nothing more to think about. I smiled. I don't know where the smile came from, except that 63 years of life had taught me how to keep my face steady when my chest was doing something else entirely. I said nothing. I took their coats. I showed them to the dining room. I served the roast I had made from a recipe that used to be my late husband's favorite, and I refilled water glasses, and I answered when one of the younger associates asked me, kindly enough, how long I had worked for the family. With a simple, "Quite a while now." I did not correct him. I watched my son laugh at the head of the table, watched him tell a story about a case he'd won, watched him glance at me only when his wine glass was empty, and I understood, somewhere in that long evening, that I had officially become invisible in my own dining room. In the house where I had raised him, in front of people who would never know my name because my own son had decided it was easier that way. What surprised me most wasn't Daniel. It was Melissa. She had known me for 6 years, had sat at my kitchen table more times than I could count, had called me Mom at her own wedding in front of 200 people. And that night, she sat there in her beautiful dress and said nothing at all, not one word, while her husband erased me in front of strangers. She wouldn't meet my eyes when I set her plate down. I understood, watching her, that her silence wasn't cruelty exactly, it was something smaller and sadder than that, a simple unwillingness to make the evening uncomfortable for anyone but me. After the guests left, after I'd cleared the last of the dessert plates and the house had gone quiet again, Daniel found me in the kitchen. I thought, for one foolish moment, that he might apologize. Instead, he leaned against the counter with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes his evening was a success, and he said, "It was just easier that way." I asked him what he meant, though I already knew. He shrugged. He said his colleagues were the kind of people who came from money, real money, generational money, the kind of people who'd never had to explain why a successful 35-year-old attorney still lived in his mother's house. He said it would have complicated things, made him look less impressive, if they'd known the truth that after Melissa's business had struggled and their savings had thinned out, they'd moved in with me 2 years earlier, into the house I had lived in for 30 years. The house his father and I had built our whole life inside of. He said this without any apparent awareness that he was describing, quite plainly, an act of cruelty as though it were simply good strategy. He didn't ask how I felt. He assumed, I think, that I would understand, the way I had always understood, the way I had spent my whole life quietly absorbing whatever needed absorbing so that his path forward could stay smooth. I went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time. I thought about all the years I had spent making things easier for him, nursing him through childhood illnesses alone after his father's heart attack, working extra shifts to pay for his law school books. Sitting through every milestone of his career applauding a version of success that had somehow made him ashamed of exactly the woman who'd made it possible. I thought about the word he'd used. Maid. Not because there was anything wrong with the work of a maid. Mind you, there is dignity in every honest job, and I had scrubbed those very floors myself for 3 decades without shame. It wasn't the word that hurt. It was what the word was for. He hadn't needed a lie that night. He'd needed me erased, and maid was simply the easiest way to erase a woman standing in her own kitchen. I didn't sleep much, but by morning, I had made a decision I didn't fully understand yet myself. A few days later, Daniel came home from the office to find that the locks had been changed. He tried his key twice, I imagine, before it occurred to him to knock, and when I opened the door, I didn't invite him back in right away. I simply handed him an envelope that had been sitting on the kitchen table since that morning, and I watched his face as he read it. "You were embarrassed to call me your mother," the letter said. "So I won't embarrass you anymore. I want to be honest, I did let him back in that day, if only to gather a few things, because I am not a woman who leaves her own son standing in the cold no matter how deeply he has wounded me." He stood in the hallway looking at the changed locks as though they were a personal insult rather than the natural consequence of his own words, and for a moment I almost softened, almost told him to forget the whole thing and stay. But I thought of Melissa's silence at that table, an easy laugh he'd used to erase me, and I found I could not take the words back even though some old, tired part of me wanted to. But I told him, calmly, that he and Melissa would need to find their own place. I told him I loved him, which was true, and that loving him didn't mean I had to keep disappearing so he could feel comfortable. He didn't understand. I could see that plainly on his face. He thought, I believe, that I was punishing him, reacting out of hurt feelings that would cool down given enough time. He told me I was overreacting to one comment. He told me I was being dramatic for a woman my age. He said several things that night that I won't repeat, mostly because repeating them would only prove how little he understood about what he'd actually done. What he did next surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. He went to a lawyer. My son, the corporate attorney who had built an entire career on contracts and fine print, apparently believed that somewhere in the paperwork of our family there might be a technicality that would let him force his way back into a house he assumed on some level already belonged to him. I don't know exactly what he expected to find. What he found instead was the truth, laid out plainly by a lawyer who had no reason to soften it for him. The house had never been his. His father, my husband, had left it to me entirely, in a will written years before Daniel had ever needed a place to fall back on. And the mortgage, which Daniel had always assumed I was still slowly paying down with whatever a retired nurse could manage, had been paid off in full nearly a decade earlier, quietly. Through years of careful saving that I had never once mentioned to him because it wasn't the kind of thing a mother brags about to her son. Every wall of that house, every beam of it, belonged to me and only me. Daniel, I later learned, sat in that lawyer's office for a long time without saying anything at all. I want to be clear, because I think it matters, that I never intended to put my son out on the street. I am not a cruel woman, and despite everything, I never once stopped loving him. A mother's love doesn't switch off simply because her son has behaved badly, even very badly. What I wanted, what I had perhaps wanted for years without fully admitting it to myself, was for him to finally stand on his own. He was 35 years old. He had a law degree, a good income, a wife, and every capability in the world to build a life that didn't quietly depend on his mother's house and his mother's silence. I had let him lean on me for so long, in so many ways, that I think somewhere along the line he had stopped seeing me as a person at all, and had started seeing me only as a kind of permanent, convenient fixture, useful, dependable, and easily hidden away when company came. The months that followed were quiet. I heard from Melissa occasionally, brief messages that grew a little warmer over time, as though she too had needed some distance to see things clearly. I heard almost nothing from Daniel at first, and I won't pretend that didn't hurt. There were evenings I sat at that same dining room table, alone with a cup of tea, and wondered whether I had done the right thing, whether I had traded a difficult relationship with my son for no relationship at all. But I never regretted it, not really, not even in the loneliest of those evenings. I had spent too many years making myself smaller so that other people could feel bigger. I was not willing to spend what remained of my life doing the same. Almost a year passed before Daniel came back. He didn't call first, which surprised me. I opened the door one Saturday afternoon and found him standing on the porch, and I almost didn't recognize him at first, not because he looked older, though he did, but because of what was missing. There was no expensive car in the driveway. He told me later he'd sold it. There was no tailored suit, no colleagues trailing behind him for me to perform in front of. He was wearing an ordinary sweater, and he was holding a bouquet of flowers, a little crooked in his hands, the way a much younger version of him used to hold dandelions he'd picked from the yard. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "I'm proud to be your son." I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at him. I won't pretend the year hadn't changed things between us, because it had, and I think it needed to. But I could see, standing there, that something in him had genuinely shifted, not the polish, not the performance, but something underneath it, something closer to the boy I remembered before success had taught him to be ashamed of where he came from. He told me, standing on that porch, about the year he'd had losing the false comfort of a house he'd never truly earned, learning what it actually cost to build a life from nothing, understanding, finally, what it must have taken for a widow with no help to raise him alone and give him every opportunity he'd ever had. He didn't ask to move back in. He didn't ask for anything at all. He had simply come to say what he should have said a long time ago. I smiled at him, and this time the smile wasn't the kind I'd worn that terrible dinner night, the kind that hides something underneath it. This time it was real. And for the first time in a very long while, I stepped aside and invited him into the house, not because he had asked, not because I owed him anything, but because he had finally learned to walk through my door with respect instead of entitlement, and that, more than any apology, was the only invitation I had ever really been waiting for. The greatest inheritance isn't a house, or the things a house holds, or even the address people are willing to admit to when it suits them. It's remembering who helped you build your life in the first place, long before you had anything worth showing off. I think about that dinner sometimes, the roast and the good china and the word he used so easily in front of strangers, and I don't feel angry about it anymore. I feel grateful, oddly enough, because it forced a reckoning that might otherwise never have come for either of us. What would you have done, I wonder, if your own child introduced you as the maid?